There was a night in the late 1970s when Scorpions played a club in the American Midwest and looked out from the stage at a room that was less than half full. The lights were up too bright, the way club lights always are when the crowd is thin and the promoter has stopped trying to create atmosphere. The few people who were there were polite. They applauded at the right moments. They did not particularly care. Rudolf Schenker stood on that stage and played every note as if the room were full. He always did. Not because he believed in pretending. Rudolf Schenker was never a man who confused performance with reality, but because he understood something about this kind of work that took most musicians years to learn. The audience you have tonight is not the audience you are playing for. You are playing for the one that does not know you yet. You are planting something in every city that will only grow if you come back and tend it. But standing there, on a stage in a country that had not asked for them, in front of a crowd that had no particular reason to be loyal, the distance between where Scorpions were and where they needed to be felt very large. This was not what the dream had looked like in Hanover. Scorpions had started the way all bands start, with a belief so large it barely fit in the room they were rehearsing in, and a reality that had not yet caught up to it. Rudolf Schenker had been carrying this particular dream since the early 1960s, back when rock and roll was still a foreign language in post-war Germany, when the music that was changing the world came in on radio signals from the West and landed on young men like him the way certain ideas always land, like a command, not a choice. He had built Scorpions piece by piece, absorbing lineup changes and disappointments, and years of grinding obscurity with the specific stubbornness of a man who simply refuses to revise his picture of what is possible. By the late 1970s, Scorpions had done more than most European bands managed. They had built a genuine following in Germany. They had toured Japan and been treated like visiting royalty. Japanese audiences understood what they were doing long before anyone in the English-speaking world had paid serious attention. They had earned respect in corners of the European circuit that were hard to crack. They were not unknown. They were not failures. But they were not where Rudolf believed they should be. America was the thing. It had always been the thing. In the world of rock and roll in the 1970s and 1980s, America was the only verdict that truly counted. You could sell out venues across Europe and Japan and still be considered an also-ran if American radio had not decided you were worth its time. The American market did not just offer commercial success. It offered a kind of legitimacy, a stamp on the passport of rock history that nothing else in the world could substitute for. And American radio did not want Scorpions. Not yet. Not in the way that mattered. The reasons were never stated cleanly, which made them harder to fight. The accent was wrong. Klaus Meine's English was fluent, but carried the unmistakable texture of a man who had learned the language rather than been born into it. The band name helped nothing. Scorpion sounded like a novelty act to programmers making decisions based on a press sheet that arrived in their mailbox. And the simple fact of being German, in a decade when the Second World War was still within living memory for a significant portion of the American listening audience, carried a weight that no one in the band's management was quite willing to name out loud, but everyone felt. They were fighting the kind of resistance that has no face, the kind you cannot argue with because it is never clearly stated, the kind that simply keeps the door closed and waits for you to go away. Scorpions did not go away. They kept coming back. Year after year, through the late 1970s and into the early 1980s, Scorpions returned to America, the way immigrants return to a country that has not yet given them their papers, with a mixture of hope, defiance, and the specific kind of patience that looks from the outside like stubbornness, but feels from the inside like something closer to faith. They played the small clubs. They played the opening slots. They drove between cities in ways that no band at their level in Europe would have accepted without protest. And every night, Rudolf played the empty rooms like full ones. The road is not romantic when you are living it. That is a lesson every touring musician learns eventually. But it arrives differently for a German band trying to break an American market that has given them no particular reason to hope. There were the drives, long, flat stretches of American highway between cities that barely registered on a European map, in vans and buses that smelled of fast food and cigarettes, and the specific exhaustion of men who had been performing 6 nights a week for months. There were the radio stations that Klaus Meine and Rudolf Schenker would visit in the mornings before shows, promotional appearances, the grinding, invisible work of trying to put a human face on a band that America had not yet decided to care about. Sometimes the DJ knew who they were. More often, he was reading from a press sheet that someone on the label had prepared, and the conversation had the quality of 2 strangers discussing a mutual acquaintance neither of them knows particularly well. Klaus's English was good, but it was always, unmistakably, the English of a German man. And in those morning radio spots, in those 10-minute conversations with programmers who had the power to put a song in rotation or pull it forever, Klaus was aware of the accent in a way he was not aware of it anywhere else. On stage, the music swallowed everything, the language, the distance, the foreignness. But in a radio studio, face-to-face with someone deciding whether to believe in them, the accent was the first thing in the room. There is a particular kind of loneliness in trying to convince someone to love what you do when you are doing it in their language and they can hear that it is not yours. Rudolf handled it differently. Rudolf had always handled difficulty differently. He did not dwell on what the American market was not giving them. He focused on what it had not yet given them, a distinction that sounds small, but is the difference between a man who eventually quits and a man who eventually wins. He had built Scorpions on this principle. Every city that had once been indifferent and had later become an audience was proof of the same thing. Belief, applied consistently over time, changes the outcome. There was no reason in his mind that America would be any different, only slower and larger and worth proportionally more when it finally turned. But the costs were real. The costs were always real. The musicians who make the long road to success look effortless in retrospect are the same musicians who were not sleeping properly, who were eating badly, who were watching the years accumulate and the goal remain stubbornly in the distance. The Scorpions of the late 1970s were not suffering. They had enough success in Europe to sustain them, enough loyalty in Japan to remind them what it felt like to be genuinely loved. But America was the wound that would not close, and it had the particular cruelty of being invisible. From the outside, Scorpions looked like a successful band. And then, in pieces, things began to shift. The first change was not the programmers or the label or any of the industry machinery that Scorpions had been pressing against for years. The first change was the audience. People who had caught a Scorpion show in a half-empty club in 1979 were telling their friends. The word moved the way word always moves about a band that truly delivers live, slowly, personally, through the specific social network of people who care enough about music to drag someone they know to a show and make them witness something. Whatever ambivalence a radio programmer might have about their accent or their origin, the people in the room knew that something real was happening on that stage. You cannot fake that. You cannot manufacture it from a press kit. It either happens or it does not. And with Scorpions, night after night, in rooms of every size, it happened. The second change was the music itself. Years of playing to American audiences, even thin ones, even indifferent ones, had sharpened something. The songs that would become Blackout were more direct, more immediate, more perfectly calibrated to the emotional register that American rock radio understood. Not because the band had compromised, there was nothing compromised about Blackout, but because years of trying to reach an audience across a cultural and linguistic distance had taught Klaus Meine exactly how much weight a melody can carry without a single word of explanation. They had not come to conquer America, they had come to earn it. And there is a difference that takes years to understand and a lifetime to prove. The summer of 1982 changed everything. Not in one day, not with one radio ad. It was more like a tide that had been building for years and finally, in that summer, reached the shore. American radio began playing No One Like You. And then it did not stop. What followed is the part of the story that is easier to tell. The chart positions, the sold-out venues, the magazine covers, the world tours that dwarfed anything Scorpions had done before. The numbers exist. The photographs exist. But the numbers and the photographs do not carry the emotional weight of what it meant to the men who had lived through the years that preceded all of them. Rudolf Schenker has spoken about walking into American arenas in the Blackout era. The difference between the crowds that had always supported them in Europe and Japan and the American crowds arriving now, loud and converted and certain as if they had always been there. As if Scorpions had always been their band. And perhaps that is the beautiful and slightly painful thing about finally winning an audience that resisted you for years. They do not remember the resistance. They arrive fully, completely, as if no time had been lost at all. But the band remembered. The band always remembered. They remembered the drives, the radio studios at 8 in the morning, the clubs where the bartender outnumbered the audience, the years of being told, in the polite and indirect language of the music industry, that they were almost right, almost ready, almost what America was looking for, without anyone ever being specific about what was wrong. None of that time was wasted. That is the thing that takes the longest to understand when you are living through it, and the first thing that becomes obvious when you look back. The bands that break through after years of building something in the dark are almost always better at the moment of success than the ones who arrived quickly. They know the difference between a good night and a great one. They know how to stand on a stage in front of 50,000 people and treat it like the privilege it is, because they spent years on stages in front of 50, and they know, in their bodies, not just their minds, that none of it is guaranteed. A band is not made in the moment it is recognized. A band is made in every room it played before anyone was paying attention. Scorpions played a lot of rooms before America was paying attention. And by the time America finally listened, Scorpions had become exactly the band that deserved to be heard. The stadiums came. The world tours came. The anthems came. Songs that would play on radio stations for decades, attached to the memories of millions of people who would never know the names of the clubs where those songs were first shaped. That is what the long road gives you. Not just success. Something harder and more permanent than success. It gives you the knowledge that you built the thing yourself, in the dark, over years, without any guarantee that anyone would ever care. Scorpions cared. Before America did, before the world did. Scorpions cared enough to keep coming back to the empty rooms and playing them full. That is the American dream most people forget to tell. Not the overnight arrival. Not the sudden discovery. The one that begins in a half-empty club on a Tuesday night, when a man from Hanover stands on a stage in a country that has not asked for him and plays every note like the room is already full. Because he knows, in the part of him that has never learned to give up, that one day it will be. If stories like this remind you why this music still matters, subscribe, because there are more chapters from the history of rock that have never been told.